much. And thank you to Deb and Mike for inviting me to participate in this panel last week. No. But look, the theme and the subject matter was just appealed so much that I couldn't say no. And I think it's amazing how much this last day and a half has actually focused on some of these issues around going outside of walls, around breaking down boundaries, around thinking about the ubiquitous archive. The perspective that I want to take is to expand on some of the ideas that I introduced yesterday around decentralised trust systems, trust through computation. The blockchain will feature. It's not, going to be the entire content of my talk, but it's around those sorts of issues and what peer-to-peer record keeping, in a sense, could mean for future archives. So we've seen a lot in the last decade or so of shifts in society, in norms and values and innovations around keeping and sharing of information. And we've also seen a whole lot of changes that are to do with transitioning from hierarchical models to networked models. It's a movement from centralised institutions of mandated trust to networks of distributed democracy, and I've seen it written about and discussed as the struggle between network and hierarchy. These changes have been triggered mainly, I think, by some of the internet-based technologies that allow us to do business in these new peer-to-peer frameworks. Everything from print media to taxi companies and banks are feeling this kind of shift. However, record keeping has largely been stalled in traditional models of centralised control and the writing of history by the powerful. Despite having a body of theory which is actually well prepared for accommodating this kind of shift, we as a profession have, to date anyway, failed to really grasp some of the opportunities presented by internet technology, and as was so beautifully covered this morning, we haven't kept faith with people and communities with an urgent need for record-keeping systems of their own. Internet-based innovation and a flatter, more peer-to-peer based model for record keeping, I think, have the potential now to come together in new forms of record keeping systems and new forms that overcome a few of the key issues and problems with some of the systems that we work with today. Problems around trust, problems around fragility and sustainability, and resourcing and maintaining those kinds of systems. Anne Gilliland of UCLA has made the comments that in a networked society, archives will have to move assertively beyond custodial, institutional and even national and regional mindsets and embrace a global network orientation and increased definitional, there you go, it's words, words are hard, fluidity. So what I want to do is actually, okay, so that's, I love that statement, but okay, how do we then take that and start thinking about what we have now and how we transform? So I've spent a bit of time thinking about this stuff, and I've tried to identify some areas that we need to zoom in on. So if you read through standards, sets of requirements, best practices, you can identify after a while that good record keeping tends to rely on many things, but here are a couple of them. An actor, whether it be a government, a corporation, a person, with the authority, means and ability to design, implement and maintain a system, and who can make certain assurances around the persistence of the records that it keeps. And trust on the part of the stakeholders for that system, in the business done that records will be made, managed and shared in line with their expectations. However, it's also true, I think, at the same time, that it's very difficult to build a system for record keeping that its community of users will always have complete trust in. Record keeping systems are designed using current tools can be resource intensive and inherently fragile. And we know that everyone can benefit from good record keeping, and yet people with less power, less influence, less resources are typically not able to establish them for their own purposes and lack the ability to assert rights, agency, when interacting with record keeping systems controlled by others. So I think it's our job to think about what our core professional work might look like in the new world, to think about some of these elements and how we can grab some of the opportunities in technology to achieve some of the benefits that we know flow from good record keeping. So what can we look to in the world of trust through computation and specifically blockchain technology? In thinking about this kind of technology, I think it is something that does boggle the mind. And I'll just give a little warning up front. I'm sure that my kind of slightly ham-fisted and dodgy explanations of how this all works will leave you more confused than you came in. I apologise for that. But it's also because it is a paradigm shift. And Andreas Antonopoulos, who writes very well on blockchain matters, has said, with thousands of years of practical use, centralised systems of trust are accepted unconditionally and without much thought as the only model of trust. So it's a big shift for us to try to think outside of that. My journey with the whole phenomenon sort of started a couple of years ago when I just started reading articles and getting my head around it. And in a way, it reached a crescendo earlier this year, just after I moved to San Francisco, when I attended the Decentralised Web conference at the Internet Archive. Now, this was 2 days at the Internet Archive. That's the exterior. It's in Richmond, San Francisco. It's an old temple for, I think it's the Latter-day Saints temple, and it's a kind of, a church to knowledge, as Brewster Kahle would have it. Some of the cleverest people I've ever encountered were at that 2 days, and Tim Berners-Lee was there, and as you can see, I'm lurking in a slightly stalkerish way behind Tim Berners-Lee. It was a couple of days of thinking, it wasn't about blockchain per se, it was about decentralisation. It was about the fact that people, including Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, are saying, why is our knowledge, our data, our privacy being gobbled up by these behemoths of the internet age, by Google, by Facebook and the rest, and locked away? What happened to the vision of an open and free and distributed web where we can control our information, where we can share our information and have the kind of freedom that we want? So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about what blockchain technology is, and then talk a bit about what I see as some of its potential applications in record keeping. So this technology it's essentially a shared ledger. It's just that it's of the internet. It's not on a book. It is available to anyone who knows how to use it, who has applications that enable them to interact with it, and access to computers, obviously. Another way to think of it is a world database, as was suggested by Vinay Gupta in his highly recommended piece on Medium called Programmable Blockchains in Context, which is a really good primer. And I just sort of read that out really quickly, but come and see me if you want a link. This is a computational ledger that is owned and controlled by everyone who participates in it, and owned and controlled by no one actor. So by transactions being recorded in this ledger simultaneously by thousands of computers all over the world on the internet, there is a programmatic integrity to it that means you can't fake something. Everything in the system has to agree. It's mathematics. And there is an immutable record of transactions that are performed in this ledger. So the most famous the use of blockchain technology is Bitcoin, the exchange of internet-based currency, and increasingly using Bitcoin for interacting with the real world, to actually procure services, to enter into agreements with other people. There's also a concept called smart contracts, which I think is one of the more exciting aspects of this technology. There are a number of players who have gone into this area. Probably the most prominent is a company called Ethereum, and it's a platform that harnesses the blockchain to enable people to strike these contracts, these smart contracts. And essentially what they are programs. They are executable programs that says, if this happens, then do this. But it's all happening in cyberspace. The blockchain stores both the program that says, if this happens, do this, and then the data that demonstrates that certain value has been transacted and certain services have been rendered. So the most obvious use for these kinds of contracts are things that happen entirely in cyberspace, such as the transfer of ownership of an asset, which is why a lot of governments have been looking at this technology for things like land registration, where there is a shared immutable ledger that says this parcel of land has been transferred from this person to that person. And you don't have to trust that the government is maintaining those land records. It's the thousands of computers that support the blockchain mathematically that will guarantee the integrity of that transaction. But it is extending into human interaction, sort of real-life interactions. So, for example, if a television rental payment is not made on time, a TV is digitally locked until the payment is received. So this is Internet of Things stuff. This is like, you know, our fridges rising up and taking over. This is Skynet, people. I, for one, would like to welcome our new white good overlords. So yeah, I mean, I am skating over lots of, there's like so many issues just in that little aside, but anyway, I'll plough on. So once executed, the smart contract stores the transactions in a way that is unalterable and persistent. So these contracts, by existing in this environment, embody the notion of trust through computation. They remove the need for intermediaries, and also for us, potentially removing the need for a lot of the signing, emailing, stamping, recording, messy record keeping that business transactions currently rely upon. Clearly, one of the best applications for this is in business where the parties don't know or trust each other already, but that's not necessarily when it will always be used. You could say that any record-keeping transaction should make that assumption that the parties shouldn't necessarily trust one another, and so it offers itself as a very viable tool for record-keeping, particularly given the emphasis in our literature on trust. I mean, if you look at myriad, books, resources, standards, the work of inter pares, it's all about trust. The OASE model, trusted repositories or checklist track, and so forth. Inter pares 2, for example, asserts that to be considered a trusted custodian, a preserver must act as a neutral third party, that is, demonstrate it has no stake in the content of the records and no reason to alter records under its custody, and it will not allow anybody to alter the records either accidentally or on purpose. So I would ask, is any individual or group preserver capable of such absolute neutrality? Perhaps not. Perhaps thousands of machines are. It's an interesting question, this question of neutral space. So there's other benefits and ways that this kind of technology can tackle some of the problems that I identified earlier on in this talk, where I talked about trust and I talked about fragility and sustainability. So these records of these contracts are recorded and available to those with rights to see them, to access them for as long as they're needed, including in the archival pluralisation space, and without needing the kinds of significant resources that we've seen for your traditional archives. Big buildings, air conditioning, staff, and so on. Of course, they do have one very significant cost, which is the running of thousands of computers all over the world, and that is not an insubstantial cost, particularly in the age of diminishing resources. So that's acknowledged. So what I wanted to do was just think about a few potential ways that we as record keepers could think about our stuff in relation to what I've just described with blockchain technology. So thinking about, for example, business processes that might be suitable for execution by smart contracts. So, I mean, and this might happen. You might find yourself at work one day soon, and someone will come and say, we're totally implementing blockchain-based technology in this company, school, government, bank. Well, the banks are they're all over it. Yeah. So let's think about, well, how can we identify what business is going to be suitable to do using this sort of technology? We do this business analysis already. We identify functions, activities and transactions. We analyse work processes. We have a lot of this information around the stakeholders, the record keeping requirements, the access requirements for the steps in those work processes already in our heads or at our fingertips. We can identify quickly who the participants in those processes should be, the sensitivity and access requirements of the process. And just to make clear, blockchain is an internet-based phenomenon, but that doesn't mean it's all open and available. There is such a thing as private blockchain. And of course, with the banks implementing so many financial systems in this space, clearly they need to keep those secure. So I think we have a lot of that analysis and those understandings, but we need to start thinking about what is needed in real life around the technology to support it. And that includes, of course, legal frameworks, which are not always keeping up with what the internet is doing. And I know I've spoken to lawyers here and also in the United States who are very much kind of struggling to keep up with what this means in terms of contract law, the jurisdictions in which the parties might be, what jurisdictions they're covered under and all those sorts of issues. But it's worth noting that Lawrence Lessig, who some of you might know, a professor of law from Harvard, who has written and spoken about law and the internet for a very long, long time, saw this technology as almost or equally as disruptive as the internet and World Wide Web itself. So, and he's certainly working hard on how to come to grips with some of those legal issues. Am I up to the... Yes, I'm up to the end. Okay. So that's just a flavour. I mean, I think there are a whole lot of other record-keeping issues around once executed, how do we point to and enable access to legacy smart contracts? How do we contextualise those? And we've done this for other kinds of new forms of records. We're always doing this for new forms of records, from mobile working to business systems. So in a sense, this is kind of just another one, but it does, I think, have a few more curly bits around it. I would say, as a final note on this, before I get to the final note, my friend Andreas had, again, very wise words to say, which I completely agree with, that this stuff definitely creates cognitive dissonance in me, probably quite a lot amongst you right now. And so, but, in a way, that's exciting, and it's it is kind of shifting and, your regular view of things. And so that's, on balance, I think, a good thing. But just to end up, a note of caution, which is this technology has come with huge amounts of hype, huge, and to the point where people on the internet have just gotten over it, and they're like, "Oh, you're talking about blockchain? Oh, yeah, blockchain's going to make you a cup of tea, and it's going to do everything for you." So we have to be careful, and there are, I think, other forms of decentralised internet-based transactional stuff around. Blockchain may, I don't know what the future holds for it. And certainly this year, and Deb and I were briefly talking about this the other day, it's gone through some challenges with Ethereum, that platform, that's the smart contract platform I mentioned, having to do what was called a hard fork. The great hard fork of 2016, which was essentially letting all the users of their platform know that the protocol was going to change. They had a whole lot of value that was needing to be recovered by some of the participants in that environment. The only way to do it was to change the protocol. It was very hotly contested. There's now 2 versions of Ethereum. Some people feel that this diminishes the purity of the blockchain. Interesting stuff happening. But look, it's in its infancy. And I think regardless of what happens to it, it or something like it will persist. And I think for the notion of the Ubiquitous Archive and the record-keeping system that can be accessed and used by people who are not in institutions of privilege, power and resources, it holds extremely great potential. That's it from me. Thank you.